Welcome, everyone. I'm Dr. John Whyte, Chief Medical Officer at WebMD, and you're watching Coronavirus in Context. COVID-19 is really a story about innovation in terms of the progress we've made in testing, in vaccine development, and also therapeutics. A remarkable speed in which we have brought new drugs to market, as well as looked at new indications for currently approved drugs. And one area where we've seen tremendous research is in the area of monoclonal antibodies. So, to help talk about what monoclonal antibodies are, what they should be used for, I've asked Dr. Daniel Skovronsky. He's the Chief Scientific Officer and Senior Vice President at Lilly. Dr. Skovronsky, thanks for joining me.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be together.
Let's review for our audience what monoclonal antibodies are.
Sure. Monoclonal antibodies are a synthetic version of something your own body makes. So, in response to infection, your body makes antibodies, lots of different ones. We call that polyclonal, to fight the pathogen. We selected just one of those from a patient who recovered from the disease and then amplified it, engineered it, and amplified it in our labs, mass produced it in a factory so that it can be administered to other patients to fight the disease. We've done that now twice. So we have two different monoclonal antibodies, and they can be administered either alone, the first one, or together as a combination therapy.
The FDA has actually issued, as you know, three emergency use authorizations for monoclonal antibodies, as you said, either by itself or in conjunction with others. Sometimes people refer to them, whether it's right or wrong, as a cocktail or polyclonal antibodies. But just this month, in early February, the FDA issued a new emergency use authorization for two monoclonal antibodies. Can you talk to us about what that EUA said?
Yeah, thank you. Emergency use authorization it's different than a full FDA approval, but it is a way to get medicines out to patients during a state of emergency, as we have now with COVID-19. And it was based on phase 2 data and phase 3 data that we generated looking at patients who already have the virus and are sick. So this is different than a vaccine. It's not a preventative in this situation.
People with moderate to severe disease who are at high
Yes,
risk.
yeah. So they're PCR positive. It's not exactly moderate to severe. It's mild to moderate. So it's early in the disease course. So generally, within a week of having symptoms of disease is the time to use monoclonal antibodies, ours or other companies. And these are administered to patients who are still at home, who are ambulatory. This is not for hospitalized patients. And
They're
although
also
we
not
have,
on oxygen, correct?
yeah, that's right. And so amongst these ambulatory patients who are recently diagnosed, the focus is on those who have a higher risk of going on to more severe consequences of disease. And we know that. We know that many people, fortunately, most people who get infected with COVID-19 do well. They have a self-limited illness and recover uneventfully. But we understand now some of the risk factors for having worse outcome. So certainly age is the most well understood, and therefore this is certainly the authorization focuses on age as an important risk factor. So patients over the age of 65, for example, are included. We know that younger patients, for example, people over the age of 55, that have other risk factors like cardiovascular disease or hypertension or lung disease, they're also at high risk. So they're included in the emergency use. And then even below the age of 55 in younger adults, there's other risk factors that are important if you're overweight. So body mass index over 35, chronic illnesses like kidney disease or diabetes or immunosuppression. So those are the ways that we define a high risk population. And we focus the use there because that's where the benefit risk of an antibody could be the highest. And our studies focused on outcomes like hospitalization and death and the ability of antibodies to reduce that.
And it showed a 70% reduction in these outcome measures. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. We did a phase 2 trial, both for the single therapy of bamlanivimab, that monoclonal antibody, as well as the bamlanivimab and etesevimab together. We saw about a 70% reduction in hospitalization in that phase 2 trial, and then we went on and did a large phase 3 study, and we replicated it, and it was almost exactly the same result: a 70% reduction in hospitalization and all-cause death among people treated with this drug versus a placebo, which was an important and exciting finding. I think the first phase 3 study in this population.
It is an infusion therapy. The amount of time has actually been decreased significantly, correct, in terms of the time of the infusion.
Yes, so for bamlanivimab, which was originally in the authorization focused on a 1 hour infusion, subsequent to that, we generated additional data, and now, depending on the volume that different infusion centers might dilute it into, it could be as little as 16 minutes in infusion time. That helps a lot because hospitals, infusion centers are busy, and being able to get more patients infused in a short amount of time is certainly helpful.
And sometimes folks get confused with convalescent plasma. So, how is this different than the use of convalescent plasma?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a related concept. So the idea with convalescent plasma is you take an individual who's had disease and now presumably has antibodies in their blood, and you can even measure the antibodies in their blood, and you give them the plasma that contains those antibodies to another patient. There's some data for that for sure, and it's been widely used. This, instead of sort of hoping that a patient has great antibodies that can help another patient, we've produced them in a factory. So they're manufactured in a uniform way. We understand the potency. And in fact, it is, for example, the antibody that we first developed, it was, from a number of patients we looked at, the single most potent antibody in their blood. So presumably that could lead to some advantages. But the biggest advantage is the scale and the consistency of manufacture and the widespread availability, without relying on other patients to donate their blood.
So, we know we still have a lot of virus out there. We have an emergency use authorization for mild to moderate disease in high-risk patients who aren't hospitalized, aren't in oxygen, with significant reduction in hospitalization and deaths, but they're not being utilized. There's been lots of reports that the federal government has bought 1 million doses. There's no cost to patients, yet we're having trouble getting these utilized. Is it physician education? Is it patient education? We've talked to the FDA, and they've talked about there's been challenges with distribution in terms of how people find out about it. Does this frustrate you at all?
Yeah, of course it does. I think we've been working hard and together with the federal government and the states to increase awareness in the right way for patients and doctors, and also solve some of the bottlenecks. Of course, it's frustrating given the scope of the pandemic. I estimate in the United States, for example, and this is now authorized in various ways around the world and in a couple dozen countries. But in the United States, probably of the million or so doses we've shipped to the US, about 250,000 have been used. That's a lot if you thought of any new medicine in the history of the pharmaceutical industry, from launching a new therapeutic for a disease to helping potentially 250,000 patients in just a couple months. That would be a great trajectory. When you think about the scale of the pandemic and the number of people dying every day, we regret that not every dose isn't used, and so I think there's a couple of ways this is getting better. One is patients are requesting it. So more and more we're hearing stories from doctors, and the doctors themselves may not be fully aware of this treatment being available, but the patients are aware. They found something on the internet. The federal government has great information on their websites. And then they ask their doctor, and the doctor looks into it and figures out how to get it.
They
That's
want to
getting better.
request it early on.
Yeah.
That's an important point. We don't want them to be thinking about it when they're feeling so sick that
Yes.
they have to go to the emergency room. And that's been part of the challenge. And we need to educate consumers because for a long time we've told patients, don't come in,
That's right.
stay
Let's
home.
wait and see how you do.
Right. And this is most effective early on in the course of the disease. So you're right. People are finding out. And having worked at the FDA, I'm glad you said the government has very good information on their site. And they do, but sometimes it's hard to find. Let's be honest. So we're educating consumers.
Yeah, the federal government has combatcovid.hhs.gov, which sort of reminds people that there is now a FDA emergency use authorized. There are treatments for early disease, and that for people who are in this high risk category, it's not their only option is not just to wait and see if they get better. There's an option to seek treatment. So that's good. I think. Importantly, you also raise a limitation here. It's not for severe patients. Once you're severe, it's too late. It's not for hospitalized patients. If you get that sick, it's not for you. Probably we should also comment. As with any medicine, there are safety risks. Some people have an allergic reaction or anaphylaxis to the drug. It's rare, but it happens. Some people get the drug and still get worse or have clinical worsening after their drug. And so those are important warnings and precautions. But I think, getting the patients educated and seeking it, and then physicians and what we've seen from the best of the best, the top healthcare systems that are really implementing well, is they have treatment pathways where every single day they look at all of the patients in their healthcare system who've tested positive and look at which ones match up the criteria for the emergency use authorization. And then they call each one and say, there is this antibody treatment. Is this something you're interested in? And when they do that, they're able to get many, many more patients treated in their healthcare system. And they're starting to see in their own hospitals a reduction in hospitalization. So there's an activation energy to set that up for a hospital or healthcare system. It takes resources to do it, but I think they're seeing the payback in the longer term.
But what about for primary care physicians that aren't affiliated with the health system, those that are still kind of in that standard private practice, and they think their patient may be eligible for monoclonal antibodies?
Yeah.
How do they go about ordering it for their patient?
Yeah, so there's a couple of possibilities. So one is some physicians in primary care settings even have opted to set up their own infusion. They might have a room and a nurse that can put in an IV and they can do the infusion there. And they can now contact the federal government and actually request doses, and they're shipped to them again at no charge, and they can directly provide it to their patients. Others rely on infusion centers in their area, and there's a number of resources now online from the government as well as from the National Infusion Center, as well as Lilly has a phone number, and Regeneron, who also makes antibodies, has a phone number. That can just help them say, okay, based on where your patient lives, here are the 3 places closest to them where they might be able to go and get an infusion. So there has been, I think, a perception that the antibodies are unobtainable, that they're reserved for
Only for
politicians.
celebrities. Right.
Yeah. That's not the case. They're out there, and every healthcare facility that wants them has an adequate supply. There's not a shortage of them. They may have a shortage of nurses to put in IV lines or of infusion poles or whatever, but they have plenty of antibody, and they need to overcome that activation energy to get set up and administer.
And sometimes you have to be the squeaky wheel, both as a patient,
Yes.
and family member, or even a physician. I want to ask you about the variants and how these different variants might impact the effectiveness of monoclonal antibodies. We're studying it in the effectiveness of the vaccines, many of which the studies were done before there was a high prevalence of variants, similar to monoclonal antibodies. Do we know about the impact of the variant on the effectiveness of this therapy?
Yes. I will talk about the variant in a second. Let me come back to your squeaky wheel comment. It's so important. And of course, many patients contact me directly and ask, or doctors. Every single patient who is persistent, and every single physician who's persistent on behalf of their patient, either way, to my knowledge so far, has gotten the antibody. That's not optimal. It's good
No,
to
we need to
know.
make it easier. They
Yes,
shouldn't have
we
to.
want to make it easier, particularly for underserved communities where they may not be used to advocating for their own healthcare as aggressively as others. So we're trying to lower that threshold so you don't have to do this quick wheel. So let me come to the variant question now. The virus is evolving. There's no question. Primarily evolving in two ways: to become more infectious so that it can spread faster, and to overcome the host immune response, to pierce through immunity. So with respect to that first point, the most common new variant now that's talked about is so-called UK variant, or B117, which has increased transmissibility. It seems to be on the rise in the United States, although it's still just a couple of percent of all cases. We've tested our antibody in the laboratory against that, and it is able to neutralize it. So it's not a threat to the efficacy of these antibodies. Similarly, people who've been vaccinated or people who have previously been sick, this new variant, their own immune system also can take care of it equally well as the original strain. The more worrisome new variants are the ones that are called the South Africa variant or the Brazil variant, which, in addition perhaps to having some of those changes seen in the UK variant, have a number of changes in the spike protein that may make them able to pierce immunity. So in other words, even a person who's been vaccinated or a person who's been sick before and is now immune could now get sick again from this variant. They also disrupt many, if not all, of the binding of different antibodies, the synthetic antibodies as well as the natural antibodies. So those are a problem, and our hope and our conviction is to avoid them spreading further. And that's why even in this era of more and more vaccination and better therapies, social distancing and masks are so important. We don't want the new variants to spread. So far, the news is good. There hasn't been very much spread. It's very, very rare in the United States and many other countries. And those two variants in particular, the virus, although it's evolved to evade our immune system, it may be a somewhat less fit virus. So in other words, it doesn't replicate or spread quite as well. So that's probably some good news.
So let's say you got monoclonal antibody treatment, your ability to get vaccinated. We still believe that patients who have received monoclonal antibody treatment should get vaccinated, correct? But is there an issue of timing of how soon they could get vaccination after they've received treatment with monoclonal antibodies?
We don't know if there's an issue or not. We don't have data on this one way or another. The CDC recommendation, I think, is 90 days after the monoclonal antibody. But remember, if you're getting a monoclonal antibody, it is because you have COVID-19. The antibody is only indicated for people who are have the disease right now, and we have interest in using the antibody in a prophylactic way, but that isn't authorized by the FDA. But so if you've had a monoclonal antibody, you've had COVID-19, so you have your own natural immunity, presumably. So it's not a rush to be vaccinated. And a lot of people think that people who've recently been sick with COVID-19 should wait for vaccination anyways. They're not the highest priority, whereas the immune naive patients probably should be earlier in line for vaccination.
And you mentioned the authorization is only for treatment for those patients who have documented COVID infection by PCR. But there is some discussion around studying it for and potentially using it for ultimately for either pre-exposure prophylaxis or post-exposure prophylaxis. Where are you in the industry in those studies?
Yeah, thank you for the question. This is an idea that is sometimes considered passive immunization. So instead of giving someone the pathogen or a piece of the pathogen, letting them mount their own immune response, which is how most immunizations work, the idea here is just give them the antibody, which can circulate in their blood for some time and provide some protection from the pathogen. So we did a trial to test if this works. We did it in nursing homes, a phase 3 trial that looked at whether giving this to residents and staff of nursing homes prior to infection could decrease the risk of infection or even death. And that was a positive result. So we were encouraged by that. Probably vaccines are still the best option for providing strong and long-lasting immunity, but antibodies maybe could be faster. It's shorter lived, but the effect may be immediate. I don't know. In our study, we saw an 80% reduction in symptomatic disease in residents that got the antibody versus placebo. Hopefully, over time, most nursing home residents, if not all of them, get vaccinated. So it'll be important to understand how this could work together with vaccine. We just don't have that data yet.
I mentioned at the beginning about how this is a story of innovation, and there's monoclonal antibodies, but quickly there's also a medication that has been used for rheumatoid arthritis, for which you all have received an EUA for as well. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, this is almost the complete opposite, the flip side of the coin here.
That's
Whereas
why
with
I
the
pointed out.
antibodies-
It's interesting.
Yeah, with the antibodies, this is a custom designed drug that we made specifically to be against the virus, an antiviral. The drug here, baricitinib, which was already approved for rheumatoid arthritis, is a drug obviously made for another purpose. And instead of boosting your immune response, which an antibody sort of is, it's a synthetic addition to your own immune response. Baricitinib is an immune modulator that decreases your immune response. So why would we use that in an infectious disease? Well, it turns out that in the late stages of the disease, when people are in the hospital on oxygen or ventilators, there is a part of their disease is an overexuberant immune response. That's what we believe, and that's why drugs like dexamethasone, a steroid, as well as baricitinib, a JAK inhibitor, have shown efficacy in improving outcomes for those patients by modulating their own immune response. It can decrease their stay in the hospital and lead to better outcomes. So that was in a phase 3 trial also that was successful and authorized for a completely different population, for people late in the disease course in the hospital, with a completely different mechanism, lowering your immune system instead of boosting it. So it's a complicated disease, and we need different weapons for different aspects of the disease at different times of the disease course.
And it's a great point, because even with vaccination, we still need to have therapeutic options for people that still get COVID. Dr. Skovronsky, I want to thank you for taking the time today to help explain the latest research and data around monoclonal antibodies.
Thank you, John. It's a pleasure.
And I want to thank you all for watching. If you have questions, you can email them to me at drjohn@webmd.net, as well as post them on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Thanks for watching.